The Red Frost, 1816. On the 4th of July, 1816, the citizens of Savannah, Georgia, didn't gather for fireworks. They gathered around fires to keep from freezing to death. The sun was a pale, sickly violet, eclipsed by a dry fog that no wind could blow away. While the history books remember the wars of kings, they often forget the year the earth itself went silent. This is the true story of the Great Darkness, a time when the birds fell frozen from the trees in midsummer, and the world learned what it meant to starve in the shadows. The morning of June 4th in Albany, New York, began with an impossibility. Elias Thorne, a veteran of the War of 1812, stepped onto his porch expecting the humid embrace of a Hudson Valley summer. Instead, he was met by a gust of wind so piercingly cold it cracked the skin on his knuckles. He looked at his fields. The corn shoots, which had been vibrant green the day before, were now encased in a brittle gray glaze. It wasn't just frost, it was something heavier. Across the Atlantic, in the elegant villas of Lake Geneva, Lord Byron and Mary Shelley sat behind locked shutters. They had traveled for a summer of sun, but found a world of midnight. The lightning outside was constant, yet there was no thunder. The sky was a bruised charcoal. To pass the time in this post-apocalyptic gloom, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. They didn't know that the real ghost was the atmosphere itself. 10,000 miles away, the cause lay dormant and dying. Mount Tambora, a titan of Indonesia, had vanished. In 1815, it had exploded with the force of 10,000 Hiroshima bombs, ejecting 150 cubic kilometers of debris into the stratosphere. The world was now breathing the pulverized remains of a mountain, and the dust was choking the sun. By August, the poverty year had bared its teeth. In Vermont, farmers were killing their prize oxen just to stay warm inside their carcasses. In the markets of Philadelphia, the price of oats had risen by 400%. Elias Thorne watched as his neighbors turned into strangers. Hunger has a way of stripping the polish off civilization. When the grain shipments stopped, the whispers started. Some said it was the wrath of God for the sins of the new republic. Others claimed the lightning rods Benjamin Franklin had installed were draining the heat from the earth. Elias set out on foot toward Boston, hearing rumors of a hidden federal cache of grain. Along the way, he saw the sunspots, massive black holes visible to the naked eye on the dimmed surface of the sun. People stood in the middle of roads, staring upward until they went blind, searching for a sign that the light would return. While Elias fought for a bag of flour in the frozen mud of Massachusetts, the literary world was changing forever. In the darkness of Switzerland, Mary Shelley was haunted by a vision of a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the things she had put together. The cold was the midwife of Frankenstein. The bleakness of 1816 birthed the Gothic era. Without the volcanic winter, there would be no creature, no Dracula, no modern horror. Mankind was projecting its fear of the dying sun onto the monsters of the page. By July 1816, the residents of New England began to realize this wasn't just a late spring, it was an extinction event. In Vermont, the birds simply stopped singing. Travelers reported seeing thousands of swallows dropping dead from the sky, their tiny lungs blackened by the invisible sulfur still drifting from the Indonesian archipelago. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a dull copper disk that provided no warmth. It was so dim that people could stare directly at it at midday, noting the massive sunspots that looked like ink blots on a dying eye. Elias Thorne reached the outskirts of Worcester, Massachusetts in mid-July. He found a town in a state of religious frenzy. The old-school preachers were standing on top of dry goods crates, screaming that the fourth seal had been opened. They pointed to the sky, which had turned a terrifying shade of bruised violet, as proof that the day of judgment was at hand. But Elias wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for seed corn. He met a woman named Sarah, a widow whose husband had died during the year of the bloody flux, dysentery, that followed the initial crop failures. "The earth is tired, Mr. Thorne," she told him, her voice as thin as the gruel they shared. "She's decided she won't feed us anymore. My father says the stars are misaligned, but I think the world is just catching a cold it can't shake." The Great Exodus. This was the moment the American map began to change forever. Tens of thousands of families, realizing that the rocky soil of New England was now a tomb, packed their wagons. This was the birth of the Ohio fever. Driven by the rumors that the West, which was then just Ohio and Indiana, was somehow warmer, a massive human tide began to flow through the Cumberland Gap. They weren't moving for gold or glory. They were moving because the sun had abandoned them. While the American pioneers bled in the frost, the year without a summer was triggering a different kind of revolution in Europe. In Germany, a young inventor named Karl Dreis watched as his neighbors slaughtered their horses. There was no grain to feed the animals, and a horse that couldn't eat was just meat for the table. With the primary mode of transportation disappearing, Dreis began tinkering in his workshop. He was trying to solve a desperate problem: how to move a human being across distances without an animal. The result was the Laufmaschine, the running machine, 2 wheels in a line with a steering bar. This was the literal birth of the bicycle, born directly from the starvation caused by a volcano half a world away. Meanwhile, the hunger was causing the first truly global humanitarian crisis. In Ireland, the potato crops failed for the first time, a grim foreshadowing of the Great Famine 30 years later. In Switzerland, the bread riots became so violent that the army was called in to guard the bakeries. The world was interconnected by a disaster it didn't even understand. They had no satellites, no telegraphs, and no knowledge of Mount Tambora. To them, the world was simply ending for no reason at all. The climax of the summer's cruelty came on the night of July 4th. In many American towns, the traditional celebrations were replaced by communal huddling. In Philadelphia, the temperature plummeted from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 5 hours. In Canada, a foot of snow fell, burying the newly planted wheat. Elias and Sarah found themselves in a makeshift camp along the Mohawk Trail. That night, the dry fog became so thick that lanterns couldn't penetrate more than 3 feet of darkness. It smelled of burnt matches, the sulfurous signature of the volcano. "If the sun doesn't come back by harvest," Sarah whispered, watching her breath mist in the freezing July air, "there won't be a soul left alive by Christmas." Elias looked at the fire. He thought about the War of 1812, the cannons and the blood. He had survived the British only to be hunted by the weather. He realized then that the real enemy wasn't a king or a flag. It was the thin, fragile layer of air that kept the world alive. By August 1816, the Great Migration had turned the roads of New York and Pennsylvania into a funeral procession of wagons. It was nicknamed Ohio fever, but it felt more like a plague. Elias and Sarah joined a caravan of 20 wagons. These weren't the sturdy, painted Conestogas of later decades. These were rickety carts held together by prayer and desperation. People were trading silver heirlooms for bushels of moldy oats. Elias saw a man swap a Revolutionary War saber for a single salted ham. The dry fog followed them. It was a terrifying meteorological ghost, a high-altitude veil of sulfuric acid and volcanic ash that refused to be washed away by rain. It acted like a filter, stripping the heat from the sun's rays. "Look at the shadows, Elias," whispered one afternoon. Elias looked down. Even at high noon, their shadows were long, faint, and blurred, as if they were walking through a dream. The sun was a pale, pulsing orb of lilac. It looked cold. It was cold. That morning, they had found ice in their water pails in the second week of August. The bread of bark. In the woods of the Allegheny Mountains, the pioneers ran out of grain. They began to eat famine foods. Elias showed the group how to strip the inner white bark of birch trees, grinding it into a bitter, woody flour to bulk out their dwindling cornmeal. They ate boiled nettles and roasted squirrels that were so thin they were mostly fur and bone. One night, around a campfire that struggled to burn in the damp, heavy air, a traveler from the south brought news. "They say in Georgia the corn has frozen in the fields. In South Carolina, the peat bogs are catching fire from the lightning, but the rain won't come to put them out. The whole world is upside down." Elias realized then that there was no safe place. They were just moving toward a hope that the West was somehow shielded from the wrath of the sky, the copper sun, and the chemists. While Elias bled on the trail, the year without a summer was birthing the first era of modern science. In London, a young chemist named Luke Howard, the man who first named the clouds, cirrus, stratus, and cumulus, was obsessively recording the barometric pressure. He realized the fog wasn't water. It didn't dampen his clothes, it irritated the lungs. He noted that the sunsets were unnaturally vivid, blood reds, neon oranges, and bruised purples that lasted for hours after the sun went down. "The sky is choked," Howard wrote in his journal. "Something has been injected into the very veins of the firmament." He didn't know about Mount Tambora, but he was the first to realize that the Earth's atmosphere was a single interconnected system. If the air was poisoned in the east, the west would eventually breathe it. This realization would lead to the creation of the first international weather tracking networks. Mankind was finally learning that they lived on a planet, not just a patch of land. When the caravan reached Pittsburgh, they found a city under siege, not by an army, but by refugees. Thousands of New Englanders were camped along the Monongahela River, waiting for flatboats to take them down the Ohio River. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and sickness. This was the birth of the hunger typhus. In the cramped, cold conditions, lice spread the bacteria like wildfire. Elias felt the fever first. His joints ached with a deep, crystalline cold that no fire could touch. Sarah stayed by his side, using the last of their precious vinegar to bathe his forehead. "You can't die here, Elias," she hissed, her eyes fierce. "We haven't seen the green grass of Ohio yet. I promised you a summer." Outside the tent, the bells of Pittsburgh began to toll, not for a holiday, but for the dead. The city's graveyards were full, and they were starting to bury people in mass trenches. The year without a summer was claiming more lives through disease and displacement than the War of 1812 ever had. By September, the first snows of autumn began to fall, though the summer had never truly arrived. Elias, gaunt and pale but alive, helped Sarah board a flatboat headed for the Ohio Territory. The river was low. The lack of summer rains had turned the mighty Ohio into a series of treacherous sandbars. As they floated silently through the fog, they passed ghost forests, stands of trees that had been flash frozen in June and July, their dead brown leaves still clinging to the branches like rusted iron. It was here, in the silence of the river, that they saw it. The great comet of 1111 was long gone, but the sky still produced terrifying displays.
Aurora borealis flickered in the mid-latitudes, casting eerie green lights over the snow-covered banks of the Ohio. "Is it a sign?" a passenger asked, trembling. "It's a world changing," Elias replied. He looked at Sarah. "We aren't pioneers anymore. We're survivors." By October 1816, Elias and Sarah reached the Scioto River Valley in Ohio. They had expected a land of milk and honey. They found a graveyard of aspirations. The soil, usually rich and dark, was as hard as iron. "We can't plow this, Elias," Sarah said, kicking a clod of earth that rang like a stone. "The frost has gone down 3 feet." They weren't alone. Thousands of emigrants from the north were huddled in lean-tos made of hemlock boughs. The local Ohio settlers, who had barely established their own farms, were overwhelmed. This was the first true internal refugee crisis in United States history. Elias didn't wait for the ground to thaw. He knew that if they didn't have a roof by November, the year without a summer would become the winter of the grave. He traded his last possession of value, a brass compass from his army days, for a rusted broadaxe. They began to build, not a house, but a dugout, a cabin half buried in the hillside to use the earth's natural warmth. As they dug, they found something chilling: subterranean insects, cicadas and beetles, frozen solid in their burrows. Nature had been caught off guard, killed in its sleep. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was just as cold. President James Madison sat in a city still scarred by the fires of the British invasion 2 years prior. Reports were flooding in from every state. Vermont was bankrupt. Virginia's tobacco was rotted. The treasury was empty. For the first time, the young American government had to face a question that still haunts politics today. Is the government responsible for the weather? Federalists and Democratic Republicans clashed in the drafty halls of the temporary capital. Some argued that providing aid to starving farmers was unconstitutional. Others, like a young John Calhoun, realized that if the people starved, the republic would dissolve. This desperation led to the Bonus Bill of 1817, an attempt to fund internal improvements, roads, and canals. The logic was simple. If one part of the country was freezing, they needed a way to move food from the parts that weren't. The year without a summer effectively built the infrastructure of the early United States. It forced a fractured nation to link its fate together with stone and water. While the North froze, a strange anomaly was occurring in the deep South. In the coastal islands of Georgia and South Carolina, the dry fog had created a greenhouse effect. While the inland temperatures plummeted, the coastal humidity trapped what little heat the sun provided. A planter named Thomas Spalding noticed that his sea island cotton was surviving while everything else died. The volcanic ash in the air acted as a strange, mineral-rich fertilizer. This wasn't just a botanical curiosity, it was a geopolitical pivot. Because the South survived the year without a summer better than the North, the economic power of the Cotton Kingdom was cemented. The tragedy of 1816 inadvertently fueled the rise of the plantation economy, deepening the divide that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The volcano in Indonesia had inadvertently shifted the scales of American slavery. On a Tuesday in late December, Elias stepped out of his dugout. The sky had cleared for the first time in months, but it wasn't a welcome sight. The moon was out, but it was a haunting, electric blue, a phenomenon caused by the specific size of the ash particles still lingering in the stratosphere. It cast a ghostly, sickly light over the snow-covered Ohio woods. "Elias," Sarah called from the doorway. She was holding a small bowl of boiled leather soup, strips of rawhide softened over a fire. "The fire is dying. We've burnt the last of the fence rails." Elias looked at the blue moon. He felt a sudden, terrifying insignificance. All the wars, all the borders, all the dreams of the new world were nothing compared to the temper of the sky. "We stay awake," Elias said, his voice cracking. "If we sleep tonight, we don't wake up. We tell stories. We talk about the sun until it hears us." They sat huddled together, whispering memes of summer fruits, peaches, cherries, warm blackberries, treating the words like coals to keep their spirits warm.
In January 1817, just as Elias and Sarah thought they had adapted to the perpetual cold, the sky performed its final, terrifying trick. It started not with white snow, but with gray rain. The sulfur and ash in the upper atmosphere had finally begun to bond with heavy moisture. As it fell over the Ohio Valley, it turned into a black blizzard. The snow was the color of soot, staining the landscape in a macabre charcoal hue. "It's the Earth's blood," Sarah whispered, watching the dark flakes settle on their cabin's threshold. The chemical composition of the ash was toxic. Cattle that ate the black snow began to waste away, their stomachs unable to process the volcanic minerals. Elias had to spend his days shoveling the heavy leaden slush away from their dugout just to keep the roof from collapsing. Every breath tasted like a struck match. The dry fog had finally come down to earth to claim its dues. The survival of the spirit. Inside the dugout, the silence was their greatest enemy. To keep Sarah from slipping into the winter melancholy, a deep depression that had claimed several lives in their small camp, Elias began to carve. Using a piece of seasoned hickory, he carved small, intricate shapes: a sun with radiating heat, a stalk of tall corn, a leaping trout. "Reminders," he told her. "The world is just sleeping. It hasn't forgotten how to be warm." They lived on starvation porridge, a mix of ground acorns, the last of their dried pumpkin, and boiled hemlock needles for vitamin C. It was a diet of ghosts, but it kept the scurvy at bay. The change didn't happen with a roar, but with a drip. On May 10, 1817, Elias woke to a sound he hadn't heard in nearly 18 months, the rhythmic, musical splashing of water hitting a stone. He crawled out of the dugout and shielded his eyes. The sun was no longer violet, it was no longer copper, it was a searing, brilliant gold. The temperature began to climb, not by degrees, but by leaps. By noon, it was 65 degrees Fahrenheit. By the next day, it hit 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive glaciers of ice that had choked the Ohio River began to break apart with the sound of cannon fire. Across the United States, a collective sob went up. In Vermont, people ran into the muddy fields and knelt, pressing their faces into the thawing earth. The year without a summer was over. The veil had finally lifted. Chapter 17. The Legacy of the Ash. The world that emerged in 1817 was not the same one that had entered 1816. The catastrophe had permanently altered the DNA of the young American nation. The breadbasket of the world. Because the Ohio fever had pushed so many thousands of New Englanders west, the center of American agriculture shifted forever from the rocky hills of the east to the fertile plains of the Midwest. The birth of the almanac. Farmers realized they could no longer rely on luck. They began obsessively tracking weather patterns, leading to the rise of the Old Farmer's Almanac as a survival Bible. The scientific awakening. In 1821, 6 years after the freeze, scientists finally began to connect the dots between volcanic eruptions and global cooling, the birth of modern climatology. Elias and Sarah stayed in Ohio. They built a real house of white oak on the spot where their dugout had been. They planted the miracle corn, seeds that had survived the frost in a sealed jar. Years later, Elias Thorne would sit on his porch in the humid 90-degree heat of a July afternoon, sweat
beading on his forehead. He would watch his grandchildren complain about the heat, and he would simply smile. He knew a secret they didn't, that the sun is a gift, not a right. He remembered the violet skies, the black snow, and the year the world went dark. He knew that humanity is just a guest on a planet that can turn cold at any moment, and that our only warmth comes from the stories we tell each other in the dark.